Masada is a truly breathtaking sight. It is an ancient palace and fortress set on a sheer-cliffed mountaintop overlooking the Dead Sea. Here, about 73 AD, nearly 1,000 impassioned Jews tragically confronted the imperial might of Rome. The only account of the Roman siege of Masada was recorded by a Jewish historian of the time, Josephus Flavius. Josephus wrote of the uprising of the Jewish people against Roman rule, of the Jews' defeat, and of the last stand and collective death of the Jewish fighters at Masada. People have marveled at the story for centuries, but they have also asked questions. Was it true? Did Josephus give an accurate account? Why did the Jewish defenders choose death over surrender? Journey with us now as we discover the story of Masada. This is the distinguished Israeli archaeologist and military leader, the late Yigael Yadin. In 1963, he led a group of Israeli archaeologists who set out to answer some of the age-old questions surrounding Masada. Previous smaller expeditions had literally only touched the surface. The ruins above ground had been explored, but no serious digging had previously taken place. Yigael Yadin's vision of recovering Masada captured the attention of the world. He put out a call for a volunteer workforce to help with the excavation. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of volunteers came from Israel and 26 other countries. Most of the Masada artifacts on display in the BYU Museum of Art were discovered by Yadin and his team. These objects are rare and precious, among the few remaining artifacts from the 1st century of the Christian era. The Hebrew word Masad means fortress. Herod the Great, the builder of this combination palace and fortress, is unfavorably known to Christians from the Gospel narrative of Matthew. But in his prime, Herod was a very successful and wealthy ruler, rebuilding the splendid temple in Jerusalem where Jesus, Caiaphas, Nicodemus, and others spent much of their time. But only 70 years after Herod's death, Jerusalem became the scene of a massive revolt against Rome and a brutal civil war among the Jews themselves. In trying to restore peace, the Romans had to sack Jerusalem, fulfilling a prophecy Jesus had made in his final hours. That war ended at Masada, which became the setting for one of the most tragic occurrences in the history of mankind. This is a model of Masada as it would have looked during the Roman siege, around 73 AD. The three-tiered section extending down the cliff is known as the Northern Palace Complex. This was built from 30 to 20 BC. The complex also includes a bathhouse and storehouses, which are located on the summit behind the upper terrace. Herod built another palace on Masada before the Northern Palace. The construction of his Western Palace began around 37 BC. The ridge of land extending to the right of the Western Palace is where the Romans built an earthen ramp for their assault. Herod also ordered the construction of a fortified wall to surround the entire 20-acre summit. This is called the casemate wall. It is a roofed double wall with rooms inside called casemates. Most of what we know about the Jewish people at Masada is based on artifacts discovered in the casemates. The raised line encircling the mountain is the siege wall, built by the Romans to prevent the Jewish rebels from escaping. The square and rectangular outlines you see represent their army camps. During the siege of Jerusalem, all escapees had been killed, their bodies crucified on the walls of the city. Presumably, the same fate awaited anyone attempting an escape from Masada. These are wine containers, or amphorae. The one on the right was found in pieces in the Northern Palace complex on Masada. Written on it are 3 lines that label a personal wine shipment in the year 19 BC to Herod, king of the Jews. A number of pottery fragments with this identical inscription were discovered by Yigael Yadin's archaeological team. A replica of one of these is in the center of the reconstructed amphora on the left to show where the label was written. Finding Herod's name at the site confirmed its identification as the Masada described by Josephus. The label, King of the Jews, was apparently a personal title taken by Herod, partially explaining Herod's reaction to the wise men's inquiry about he who was born King of the Jews, and also Pilate's motive in placing the same title over the head of Jesus on the cross. Herod was appointed king of Judea by Rome in 37 BC. As a Jew, the grandson of a convert to Judaism, he was careful to show loyalty to his religion. But he rightly feared for his own safety because he was allied with Rome. He also feared the power of the Egyptians under Cleopatra. Thus, Masada became Herod's personal refuge. He lived in luxury, nevertheless. Herod's grandiose buildings were constructed and decorated according to styles fashionable in Rome, and they were fit for a king. This is a model of Herod's northern palace complex. It has also been called the Hanging Palace because it appears to cling to the mountainside. The royal residence was a combination Roman villa, elaborate gazebo, and banquet hall. The structures were built on natural rock terraces at Masada's northern tip. The upper level served as residential quarters. There were 2 wings of bedrooms behind a semicircular porch lined with columns. The middle level held a circular building called a tholos. This was an architectural form established by the Greeks and used in Roman temples. The purpose of Herod's tholos is debated. The structure was likely a gazebo. Its rear wall was equipped with niches that may have held books or papers. The lower level contained a banquet hall called a triclinium. This was probably used to entertain nobles and official guests. Its walls and porticos were painted in an imitation of marble. This was a style of wall painting quite popular in contemporary Pompeii. The tall columns of Herod's palaces were not single pieces of carved stone as reported by the historian Josephus. They were actually drum-shaped sections of limestone that were joined together, as you can see here. These so-called column drums were covered with plaster and sculpted to look like a single piece. An architectural element called a capital crowned the finished column. Some of the capitals at Masada were covered in gold leaf, an indication of Herod's penchant for opulence. The plaster on the columns fell away over time. These fragments of fresco were discovered in various parts of Masada. The original designs have been recreated around the fragments. In a manner of speaking, King Herod had his feet in 2 worlds. He wished to live like a Roman prince, but he also observed Jewish traditions when he decorated his palaces. Some of the fresco designs were taken from plant life, while others are simpler patterns of alternating colors. Figural representations were not allowed by Jewish religious law. They fell into the prohibited category of graven images. Fresco is the art of painting on a wet plaster surface with colors mixed in water. The paint is absorbed by the plaster, resulting in a very durable surface. The artisans who painted Herod's frescoes followed the instructions published by Vitruvius, a prominent Roman architect of the era. King Herod dined on fancy tableware like this, called terra sigillata, which means molded earth. This was the fine china of the time and was the preferred tableware in Roman high society. The plates have a glossy red surface and intricate impressed designs. Dishes like these would have served the royal family in their finest banquets. On a serving platter like this one, the head of John the Baptist may have been served to Herod Antipas, the grandson of Herod the Great. Because of Masada's remote location, far from city markets, you might be wondering about the availability of food. Indeed, King Herod had to lay in large quantities of essential foodstuffs. Here are the original pottery vessels from Herod's palaces. They held food supplies which were stored in long, narrow roofed halls. The storehouse floors typically had circular depressions to steady the round-bottomed jars. The storerooms at Masada would have held enough foodstuffs to last years. This beautiful reconstructed mosaic was part of a floor in the Western Palace. The theme of the decoration is taken from plant life, such as fig and grape leaves, olive branches, and pomegranates. The plant theme appears on most of the mosaic floors discovered on Masada. The Western Palace was the largest building on Masada, with 3 wings covering 36,000 square feet. One wing held King Herod's throne room. The Western Palace served as Herod's primary residence on Masada, and was also where his family members stayed. These are clay oil lamps that were used as nightlights on Masada. They were fueled by olive oil that was stored in the body of the lamp. A fiber wick extended from the nozzle. They held enough oil to burn all night. The 3 lamps with no decoration are called Herodian lamps. These became popular toward the end of Herod's reign or shortly thereafter. It is believed they were also used by the Jewish rebels who occupied Masada 70 years later. The lamps referred to in the New Testament parable of the wise and foolish virgins were probably much like these. In Herod's day, lamps were available in many styles, and they could be quite ornate. One popular style was decorated with radial lines. Both the plain style lamps and those with radial designs would have been acceptable to strictly observant Jews, since they had no figural representations. King Herod built this bathhouse near the northern palace. It was comparable to those in the finest Italian villas. Every floor was finished with mosaics or inlaid marble, and the walls were adorned with frescoes. Herod probably imported architects from Rome to help plan this bath. The Romans were noted for their elaborate bathing procedures. In front of the typical Roman bath was an exercise court. The bath itself contained 4 basic rooms: the dressing room, a steam room, a warm room for cooling down, and a cold pool. Roman steam rooms were heated by an ingenious system called a hypocaust. A wood-burning furnace generated hot air, which was circulated along the walls in clay tubes and underneath an elevated floor. These pedestals supported the raised floor. But where did the water come from? Masada is in a desert, and the salt water of the Dead Sea was unfit for use. This is a photograph of a huge cistern. You get a sense of the size by looking at the person standing in the cistern. King Herod ordered the construction of a brilliant system of waterworks on Masada. Cisterns were dug into the summit to collect rainwater. Channels were cut into the surrounding hills as well. They delivered the water from winter flash floods into 12 larger cisterns dug into Masada's northwestern cliffside. The stored water was hand-carried in buckets to Herod's palaces. The cisterns held ample water for all of Masada's needs, and the Jews at Masada probably could have held out against the Romans for several years. About 10 years after Herod's death, in 4 BC, Masada passed from his family to become a Roman army outpost. Then, at the beginning of the Jewish revolt against Rome in 66 AD, a group of Jewish rebels captured and occupied Masada. The historian Josephus referred to the rebels as the Sicari because of the daggers, called sika, that they carried hidden in their clothes. The Sicari made significant changes to Herod's palaces. Here is a bathtub built up against fresco wall paintings, and here a basin built on top of a mosaic floor. The Jewish rebels had no need of such decoration and must have viewed the evidence of Herod's lavish lifestyle with contempt. This is a Sicari dwelling inside a casemate. Here is a reconstruction of some features typically found in casemate dwellings. The cylindrical object is an oven. Ovens like this were made of stone and mud plaster. To the right of the oven is a stove with an opening underneath for a fire. The small hole carved into the wall above the stove probably served as a lamp holder or shelf. Thin stone walls often divided the casemates. Here are more shelves and a storage bin. They are made of field stones and plastered with mud. In Herod's time, the casemates served as guards' quarters or storage rooms. During the time of the Jewish occupation, about 85 families lived in the rooms. As other Jewish groups sought refuge on Masada, they subdivided palace rooms as well. For building materials, they dismantled portions of Herod's palaces. A mountaintop retreat that had once served one royal family now housed almost 1,000 Jewish fugitives. Here are pieces of fabric woven by these people. The dry desert climate helped preserve these remnants and their distinctive colors and markings for almost 2,000 years. These are some of the oldest fabric samples from Judea and are remarkably preserved. Cloth was made on looms, using goat hair, wool, and linen, although wool and linen were never mixed, according to Jewish law. This is a reconstruction of a typical loom of the era. The weights at the bottom, however, are the original pieces of sun-dried clay from Masada. In addition, several items used daily by the ancient Jews were found at Masada, reminiscent of several familiar passages in the New Testament. Women, like the woman at the well, put a ring like this one on their heads when carrying water jars. This basket was typical of the day, probably much like the 12 baskets filled with loaves after the feeding of the 5,000. This sandal has laces or latchets similar to those John the Baptist said he would not be worthy to unloose. An amazing discovery at Masada was actual pieces of food, remnants that have survived for almost 20 centuries. These are typical foods of the period, such as nuts, salt, grain, pomegranates, and dates. These pottery fragments found with the food are called ostraca. It was a common practice to write on pieces of pottery. They served as scratch paper and receipts in those days. The 3 pieces from broken jars are labeled finely crushed fig cake, which was an ancient pastry. Some of the small, flat pieces give instructions for rationing bread, which was probably necessary during the Roman siege. The fragments found at Masada contained writing in 4 languages: Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. Along with food and pottery notes, archaeologists found many personal items in these dwellings. These items suggest that these people managed to maintain certain standards of comfort despite their difficult circumstances. The small pottery vials held perfume, scented oil, and cosmetics. The sticks and spatulas were for applying makeup. Also found were combs, necklaces, a bronze mirror, and a piece of gold jewelry with inlaid glass. These small ring-like objects are bronze keys. These slide keys were not used to unlock doors. They opened jewelry boxes and document cases. Some of the keys were worn as rings for safekeeping. In the Bible, Christ said to Peter, "I give unto you the keys of the kingdom." People in that day may have thought of keys like these. This bronze ladle and this jug were found hidden under a floor in the casemate. These, as well as scores of coins, were overlooked by Roman soldiers who looted the site after the siege. Along the casemate wall near the Western Palace, the archaeologists uncovered this large hall. The building could accommodate about 250 people. Around the walls were large steps that could serve as benches. These were partly made with columns taken from Herod's northern palace. Several features of this building conformed with Jewish traditions regarding the construction of synagogues. Thus, Yigael Yadin believed that the people at Masada had built a synagogue. Josephus had written little about Sicarii religious practices. Yadin wanted to answer an age-old question. Were the Sicarii political revolutionaries, religious dissenters, or just outlaws? Then, the archaeologists made an incredible discovery. Buried in a hole in the floor of the hall was a scroll. It turned out to be chapters from the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy. According to Jewish custom, sacred Hebrew writings were never discarded or destroyed. They were buried in consecrated ground. The discovery of the Deuteronomy scroll confirmed Yadin's belief that the hall was indeed a synagogue. It dated to the 1st century AD, and in Yadin's day, this building was the oldest synagogue ever excavated. The Jews at Masada also built a number of mikvaot, or ritual immersion pools. The presence of the mikvaot is another indication that these people strictly observed the Jewish law. These baths typically consisted of 3 separate components. First, a basin that collected pure water, or water that was non-drawn, such as rainwater. Second, a foot and hand bath, and the immersion pool or mikveh itself. In addition, several pieces of pottery were found, showing that some of these Jews had even set aside offerings to be paid someday as tithing after the war was over. The Israeli archaeologists found additional buried scrolls on Masada. This parchment contains part of the Book of Psalms. Little doubt remained that the people at Masada were deeply committed to their religious beliefs. The other 2 contain writings not included in the Old Testament. One fragment is thought to be from the Book of Jubilees. It contains a reference to the Prince of Hatred, who appears in that book as the head angel of the forces of darkness. The other piece is thought to be a Samaritan composition because the words Mount Gerizim are written on it. Mount Gerizim is a Samaritan holy site. The presence of this writing on Masada suggests the diversity of the peoples who sought refuge there. These iron arrowheads are typical of those found on and around the mountaintop. Amid the routine of everyday life and religious observance, the Sikari had to attend to the defense of their fortress. They converted a room in the Western Palace into an arrow-making shop. They also hewed large round stones out of solid rock to roll down on the Romans in the event of an attack. The Jewish revolt that began in 66 AD shook the Roman Empire. It took 6 years for the Roman army to destroy the resistance and restore peace in Judea. But one pocket of resistance remained, on Masada. The Romans were determined to crush this last band of rebels completely. These panels depict a Roman foot soldier and a Roman horseman in full battle regalia. The Roman army that marched across the desert in 72 AD to besiege Masada was an impressive fighting force. Notice that the horseman's armor was made up of hundreds of metal scales. Scaled armor was a Roman innovation of the mid-1st century AD. This centurion is typical of the Roman soldiers stationed 40 years earlier by Pilate at Golgotha. And this spearhead would have been the kind of weapon they would have used. The battle-hardened 10th Legion was led by General Flavius Silva, one of the top commanders in the destruction of Jerusalem 2 years earlier. The end of the Jewish resistance on Masada was approaching. These are fragments of Roman military uniforms and equipment discovered in the Roman camps and on Masada. Between 7,000 and 8,000 Roman soldiers marched on Masada, plus thousands more Jewish prisoners to carry supplies and build fortifications. These people top Masada with 960 men, women, and children gazed down on an awe-inspiring force that outnumbered them by at least 10 to 1. In the lower half of this diagram is the western side of Masada, with the eastern side at the top. The white space in the center is the summit. General Silva's army established 8 camps in a ring around Masada. These are designated by the letters A through H. Shown in the lower left are camps F and E. To their right is where the Romans built the ramp to Masada's summit. The 2 largest camps were F at the bottom left and B at the top center. These camps were similar to standard Roman legionary camps. They were rectangular and surrounded by protective walls with a gate in each wall. Inside, tents were set up on stone foundations, all arranged along orderly streets. Smaller camps were built into the siege wall itself and served as observation posts. Roman camps functioned almost like towns. In addition to soldiers, the army included doctors, cooks, and supply trains. Soldiers' families were typically allowed to camp outside. Also welcome were traveling merchants who traded with the army. The largest camps consisted of a command post, a central court with an officer's dining hall, places of worship, a marketplace, and a treasury. Yigael Yadin's team excavated one of the 8 Roman camps. Among the remarkable articles they found were these small bronze objects, Roman medical instruments. There are 2 small spatulas and a knife handle. The larger object is a cupping vessel. This vessel was heated and then pressed against a patient's back. It was believed that the suction created would draw out illness. This is a papyrus fragment found near Masada. It contains a list of medical supplies written in Latin and the name of the doctor in charge. This sandal was worn by a Roman soldier. A soldier was expected to march up to 30 kilometers a day. For this reason, their leather sandals were shod on the underside with metal studs. Other personal effects of Roman soldiers include these orange pottery bowls with linear patterns made by Nabateans, a group from the east and south of Judea who traded extensively with the Romans. These buckles and amulets are in a remarkable state of preservation. Among the smallest objects are bronze statuettes that depict Egyptian gods. Roman soldiers tended to be superstitious. They usually paid homage to local gods wherever they were posted, and typically carried amulets like these for protection against danger. These handsome objects are imperial lamps. The larger one has a round reservoir to hold oil, a delta-shaped handle, and 2 nozzles for a double-wick flame. These lamps represent an ornate Italian style quite different from the Herodian lamps used by the Jews. Unlike the Jewish items, many Roman objects were decorated with animals and human figures. This photo shows a soldier's pay record. Roman soldiers had to buy food, clothing, bedding, and weapons out of their own pay. Deductions were also made for retirement, and soldiers were expected to pay their own burial expenses in advance. The Roman army decided to attack when no sign of surrender materialized on Masada. This is a model of their most impressive war machine, the siege tower. The Romans had to find a way up the cliffs and over the walls into Masada. Thousands of troops and prisoners spent about 3 months hauling rock and timber to build a solid ramp to support the siege tower. Josephus said the tower stood 60 cubits tall, probably the height of an 8-story building. The tower, covered with iron plates and mounted on wheels, was rolled up the ramp to the casemate wall. Catapults and dart throwers were on the bottom floors of the tower. Soldiers inside the tower used the catapults to hurl stones called ballistae. Many stone balls such as these were found at Masada. A huge battering ram near the top of the siege tower pounded the stone walls until they crumbled. As the walls gave way, the defenders built an inner wall of timbers and earth that absorbed the impact of the battering ram. The Romans set fire to the timbers and waited for these last defenses to burn down. By nightfall, it was clear to both sides that a Roman victory was at hand. It was the evening of Passover, and when the wind shifted against them, the people at Masada knew that the destroying angel was not going to pass them by and deliver them as he had their forefathers in Egypt. The defenders could only watch as their last hope went up in smoke. But they refused to waver in their fierce resistance against Roman domination. That night, they made a fateful decision. The pottery fragments here may be the most dramatic find made on Masada. Each has a Hebrew name written on it. One of them is Ben Yair, perhaps the resistance commander himself. Since the fragments were discovered together, they might be the lots that were cast on that final night. The commander, Eleazar ben Yair, persuaded his followers to choose death over surrender. Surrender would have involved harsh punishment and enslavement, if not torture, rape, and execution. Another group of Sicarii arrested in Egypt were tortured and put to death when they refused to compromise their faith by swearing an oath of loyalty, accepting the Roman emperor as Lord. The order was given for the men to kill their women and children. Then the men drew lots to determine who would kill the others. They exposed their throats to the swords of their comrades, and the last man set the palace on fire and killed himself. When the Romans breached the wall the next morning, they were met by an eerie silence and close to 1,000 dead bodies. These braids of hair were among the few human remains found on Masada. Eleazar's last defiant words to his men still echo from Masada. "We preferred death to slavery." This is a fragment of a scroll found at Masada. It contains the part of the book of Ezekiel describing the prophet's vision of bones. It reads, "The Lord set me down in the midst of the valley, which was full of bones. Thus saith the Lord God unto these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and ye shall live. Come from the 4 winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live." The prophet Ezekiel watched, and the bones rose up and came to life. Perhaps Yigael Yadin and his associates felt a connection with this vision as they explored the ruins of Masada and brought the story to life once again. The scroll continues, "Son of man, take thee 1 stick, and write upon it for Judah. Then take another stick, and write upon it for Joseph and all the house of Israel. Perhaps the people at Masada also looked forward to the restoration of Israel in a later day. The scene of the Jews' historic struggle is now a shrine of Israeli patriotism and is a destination for visitors from all over the world who are interested in the early history of Israel. But this is not the end of our story. Not far from Masada, another incredible discovery was made: a series of manuscripts of ancient sacred texts known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. About 10 miles north of Masada is Nahal Hiver. 30 miles north of Masada is the site of Qumran. Qumran was occupied from about 250 BC until 68 AD, when it was destroyed by the Romans during the Jewish revolt. Before this attack, the inhabitants of Qumran hid hundreds of their religious documents in clay jars in nearby caves. This is a model of Qumran. Its inhabitants were members of an ancient Jewish sect called the Essenes. The Essenes lived apart from other Jewish groups in austere isolation. They followed strict Jewish law. Qumran was not built like a typical village. The excavated ruins revealed a dining hall for communal meals, a bakery, and a pottery workshop. A sophisticated water system existed, as well as ritual immersion pools. Similarities with certain features at Masada are evident. Was there a connection between the people at Qumran and some of the people at Masada? Some of the texts discovered at Masada reveal the same distinctive style and subject matter found in the scrolls from Qumran. This has led many researchers to believe that people fleeing the Roman attack at Qumran also sought refuge on Masada and brought some of their sacred texts with them. One room at Qumran is called the Scriptorium. It contained long tables, where some of the Dead Sea Scrolls may have been written. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy found several scrolls inside a cave near the ruins of Qumran. These and hundreds of other scrolls found in nearby caves are known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a precise replica of one of the most important scrolls discovered. This scroll contains all 66 chapters of the Old Testament book of Isaiah. The Essenes in the desert at Qumran gave special reverence to the prophecies of Isaiah because of his command to prepare a way for the Lord in the wilderness. This is one of the longest Dead Sea Scrolls, measuring over 24 feet. It has 54 columns and is written on 17 pieces of leather stitched together with linen thread. This replica is the same size and material as the original. The Great Isaiah Scroll has been dated between 200 and 100 BC. Before it was discovered, the oldest surviving Hebrew manuscript of Isaiah came from the 9th century AD. Surprisingly, the text of the two manuscripts is essentially the same, despite their 1,000-year age difference. This shows that the book of Isaiah was handed down over the centuries with considerable accuracy. This is a miniature bronze incense altar. It was discovered in 1950 at Qumran, and it is the only one of its kind. The altar has 4 horns in the corners, much like the larger incense altar known to have been inside the Temple of Jerusalem. Altars or incense burners with a similar shape have been found in ancient sites around the world, including Egypt, the Middle East, and Mesoamerica. Inside the temple, incense would have been burned on the altar twice daily at the times of ritual offerings. The perfumed smoke would rise and fill the rooms with sweet smells, perhaps also symbolizing prayers ascending to God. This is a replica of another important Dead Sea Scroll. It is known as the Manual of Discipline, or in Hebrew, the Rule of the Community. It details the daily life, behavior, religious activities, and organization of the Essenes at Qumran. It contains the rules for sharing worldly possessions and discusses blessings on the obedient and curses on the wicked. The text is believed to have been written between 100 BC and 75 BC. Several copies of the Manual of Discipline were discovered in the caves near Qumran. These fragments are some of the most breathtaking to have been unearthed in all of history. These extraordinary pieces are on loan from the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. 2 of them have been unseen by the public for many years. One of the documents is a rare appendix to the Manual of Discipline scroll, and one is one of the oldest scrolls from Qumran. They are the Words of Moses, Testimonia, Paleo-Exodus, and the Messianic Rule of the Congregation. They contain primarily biblical excerpts, sections of the sacred texts that were of great importance to the people at Qumran, important enough to be copied with care, studied with devotion, and hidden for safety when the lives of the members of this sect became endangered. This jar and lid come from Qumran. They were purchased from a dealer in Bethlehem in 1965 by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. To hide their scrolls, the Qumran dwellers wrapped them in linen and placed them in jars such as this one, perhaps hoping that they would eventually be found by members who might someday return. In doing this, they kept their covenant to keep their sacred teachings secret and fulfilled their promise to preserve the books of the community. They also followed a biblical example. Jeremiah likewise placed a sealed scroll in an earthen jar so that it would continue many days. 60 years after Masada fell, another rebellion was launched to resist the Romans in Judea. Shimon bar Kokhba led this second Jewish revolt in 132 AD. This original papyrus fragment dates back to that time. A companion document is a Hebrew deed describing how 4 men will share the land they have leased. One of the lessees was named Alma, son of Yehuda. This scroll was discovered by Yigael Yadin in 1961. He found it in a goatskin bag in the Cave of Letters at Nahal Hiver, 10 miles north of Masada. Bar Kokhba conquered Jerusalem and re-established a Jewish state. But the Jews' success was short-lived, and they were defeated by Rome in a little over 3 years. The fall of Masada and Bar Kokhba's defeat marked the end of an era of Jewish history. After Rome's victory in 135 AD, Jews were banished from Jerusalem. For the next 1800 years, Jewish history would be the story of the scattered communities of the diaspora, until a national Jewish state was established once again in 1948. The discovery of the biblical writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls 50 years ago, followed by the incredible findings made at Masada, provided the returning Jews with a powerful connection to their past and to their ancient homeland. This exhibition allows us to step back in time, to view history, geography, and religion in a whole new light, and to learn from people who truly lived and died by their convictions.